So this is the Charles Madison Nabrit Memorial Garden. Now it doesn't look like this right now because, it's winter. And it didn't always look like this. But the seeds of spiritual and cultural connections to gardens, that was always there. And so these first two photographs, this first one is a photograph of my maternal great-grandmother, Hattie Edwards, in her class at Bluefield State Teachers College in 1898. And what's interesting is she lived until I was 11, so I knew her really well. She and my great-grandfather, when they finished in Bluefield, relocated to Columbus, Ohio, and were one of the first congregants at our church. The other photograph is my late husband's paternal grandparents, the Reverend Dr. and Mrs. James Nabrit in this photograph. But he also was in college at Morehouse in 1898. So Charles and I both came from families that had been in this country since the late 1700s. We both come from families that have been pursuing lifelong marriages for as long as it's been legal for black people to do so. We're both from families that have been pursuing post-secondary education for as long as it was legal for black people to do so. So the seeds of resilience and the seeds of resistance were already there. And so when we met and married and had our children, Charles initially saw them as heirloom seeds. Now, I wish I could say I was on the same page. I didn't get that. And so that conflict came to the surface pretty quickly. When we had the children, the summer before my last year in law school, we had our twins. And so when I graduated, they were 13 months old, and I had nursed them for the first year and was starting to buy baby food, and Charles said, "Sweetie pie, we don't know who's bottling that. We need to grow our own food." And I looked at him and thought, "You are such a freak." But what I said was, I went to CSG, and when you met me, when you were at Dartmouth, you met me, I was at Wellesley. And I just graduated from law school at the Ohio State University. Like, I don't know who you think has time for that. And he looked at me so calmly and said, "Sweetie pie, gardening is like parenting and pastoring. It requires the same daily attention to detail in the same posture of humility, head bowed, body bent. People who don't have time to garden probably don't have time to parent." And I was like, okay. Paradigm shift. So that was my introduction to gardening. So by that next year, when our third son, Evan, was born, Damon and Charles were already 2, and they were working in the garden with their father and I. And so through all the intervening years, the corporate jobs, the relocations, starting our own business, homeschooling our kids, writing books, the constants were the garden, Sunday school, church, and family dinners. So when Charles died in 2013, it was pretty traumatic. We had been married for 36 years, 8 months, and 22 days. And so my sons and nephews, we decided that we would take this garden motif and expand it into a memorial garden. And so we went to the pastor and the board of trustees at our church and said, "Can we use this empty fallow field?" And they said graciously, yes, you can. And so we bought 700 feet of untreated lumber, and I'm using the royal we built 40 raised beds. We lined them with cardboard for organic weed control, and we bought 40 tons of organic soil and wheelbarrowed it in. And the we was Damon, Charles, and Evan, and my nephews, David, Samuel, Joseph, Benjamin, and my niece, Alexandria. And so as we worked through that winter into the spring, I thought about that line from Richard III, when Shakespeare, that line that says, "Now was the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer through the son of York." Now, granted, the rest of Richard III is kind of funky, but that line, that line really kind of spoke to what was happening, because the garden really was a space for our free grief therapy. And so we gridded the beds for square foot gardening and companion planting, and Damon and Charles designed and installed an above ground drip irrigation system on a solar powered timer. And so I was sort of left with this first hashtag of he started us in a garden for a reason. There was a lot of healing happening there. And so we planted 3,000 seeds that first year and 100 live plants. And we knew we wanted that space to be biodiverse, so we had lots of fruits and herbs and flowers. And the flowers weren't just for the cross-pollination. It wasn't just because we're a monarch way station. We also had the flowers for the aesthetics. We weren't trying to recreate the Tuileries, but we wanted it to be a space of real beauty, abundant beauty. And speaking of abundance, there was this whole harvest, because we started doing this work as free grief therapy. I didn't do the kind of strategic thinking about, like, what are we going to do with all this food, right? So the harvest came in, and I thought, no problem, we'll donate it to the food pantry, because our church has a big food pantry like most churches do. But they weren't really prepared for that. And so the first thing about the harvest was we had the harvest of the produce, but then we ended up with harvest of data. So we looked at the USDA Economic Research Service, and it identifies our zip code as a low-income, low-access urban food desert, because more than 33% of the households are at or below the poverty line. 13% don't have access to a car, and the closest supermarkets are 4.3 miles away, Whole Foods and Trader Joe's. And so we decided that, first of all, we were going to switch from the language. We weren't going to continue saying an urban food desert, because deserts are naturally occurring environmental circumstances. This isn't really naturally occurring. So we decided to use the term urban food apartheid. And we decided that our first hashtag was going to be, we fight urban food apartheid. And the way that we fight it is we host an on-site farmer's market where we sell the produce for $1 a pound. And so what's interesting about that is then the harvest of the produce and the harvest of the data led to this harvest of humans. Because first people were coming in just a trickle at a time to help, but it expanded. And one of our earliest and most elderly volunteers and visitors, Mr. Ringo, after the third visit, took me aside and said, I want to thank you. This really reminds me of my work with George Washington Carver, which was my first hint. You are not a young person. But as he was talking to me, and he said, you know, I want to talk about what's been lost through the Great Migration and why it is so many black churches have food pantries and so few have gardens. And whether or not this is a reflection of post-traumatic slave syndrome. Now, granted, post-traumatic slave syndrome, that's a topic for a whole nother TED Talk. But the thing that I did think about was this next hashtag of we were brought here to cultivate, and how we really need to reconnect with both the spiritual and the cultural components of gardening in black communities. And then there was the whole issue with the benches. The benches came about because of a lack. We lack storage. So when people come to the garden for the produce, or when they come for the concerts, if they come for the farmer's market, they have to wait for us to harvest. So if someone says, I want a pound of sugar snap peas, they have to wait for us to harvest it. And while people are waiting, they're engaging. And you might have noticed from the earlier picture, there was a wide range of people who were coming to this space. So we had very young learners, little ones, 3 and 4 years old. We had elderly people. We had kids in the neighborhood, kids from the congregation, friends of mine from CSG, from the Wellesley Club, from the Women's Board at Franklin Park Conservatory, because again, where else are you going to get organic leeks for $1 a pound? So you have a wide range of people coming into this space. But the other thing that happened with the benches is that the more benches that we have, the more elderly people came. And they came not necessarily to work, they came to advise. They came to advise. But what was also interesting was the more elderly people that were there, the more younger people came. It was as though the elderly people drew the younger people in the same way that our giant zinnias attract hummingbirds. And so, like in this one photograph, you can see Sister Cecily sitting there with my son Charles. Sister Cecily was probably 91 when that picture was taken. That other photograph is my mom, who was probably 87 or 88 in that picture. And she's sitting there with students who were interns with the National Park Service, who were students at Central State University and Wilberforce University. And so this whole diversity across generational lines made me think about this other gardening issue, which is new growth on old wood. And so this idea of new growth on old wood happens beyond generational differences. We also saw it with the new resources like the hoop house that we're having installed, and with new technologies, with students and faculty from the College of Engineering at Ohio State who are working on this farm bot and the solar panels. And so the thing about gardens that extends beyond the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, because we see the evidence of gardens across belief systems and across the human experience, because they are inherently places of peace and tranquility and healing. But they're also spaces of growth, which means there's going to be conflict because every seed bursts its container. And so when we talk about that, it relates to this issue of death, because death is in many ways like a hard pruning, which makes space for new energies and new growth. So my invitation is absolutely come and visit us at the garden. But beyond that, look for spaces in your own community where you can try cross-planting and cross-pollination, because the benefits of biodiversity and cross-pollination extend to all carbon-based life forms. Thanks.